The candles had barely finished burning when Duke Alastair Rothvane turned to his new wife and said the words that would change everything. "Give me an heir and then disappear." Alara Whitmore stood in the middle of the grand bedchamber, still wearing her wedding gown, her hands cold despite the fire roaring in the hearth. She had expected coldness. She had not expected cruelty delivered so plainly, so early, before the door had even fully closed behind the last servant. "I beg your pardon," she said, though she had heard every word clearly. Alastair did not look at her as he unfastened the cufflinks from his sleeves. His voice was flat, the tone of a man discussing accounts rather than a marriage. "You heard me. This union exists for one purpose. Once that purpose is fulfilled, you may return to wherever you please. I will not interfere. I will not ask questions. You will simply go." The fire crackled. Somewhere below, in the halls of Rothvane Manor, the last guests were still finishing their wine, unaware that the bride they had toasted only hours ago was being told, in no uncertain terms, that she was nothing more than a means to an end. Alara had known this marriage was arranged for practical reasons. Her family's estate was drowning in debt, and the Duke's coffers were the only thing standing between her father and ruin. She had accepted the match with her eyes open, prepared for indifference, prepared even for distance. But she had not prepared for this, a demand so blunt it felt like a slap across the face. "I see," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that made Alastair finally glance up. He expected tears. He expected pleading or perhaps anger that would burn itself out by morning. Instead, he found her watching him with an expression he could not quite name. Not sadness, not rage, something colder and more deliberate. "You see," he repeated, testing the words. "Good, then we understand each other." "We do," Alara said, "perfectly." She turned away from him and began removing the pins from her hair, one by one, her movements unhurried. Alastair watched her for a moment longer, half expecting her composure to crack, but it did not. Eventually, he left the room without another word, retreating to his study as he always did when something unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Alone, Alara sat before the mirror and studied her own reflection. The woman looking back at her was not the girl who had walked down the aisle that morning, hopeful despite everything, telling herself that perhaps kindness could grow where love had not been planted. That girl was gone already, replaced by someone sharper, someone who understood exactly what kind of man she had married. She thought of her mother, who had died when Alara was 12, and the quiet strength the woman had carried through every hardship without ever raising her voice. She thought of her father, gentle and foolish with money, who had wept when he told her about the arrangement, apologizing over and over even as he signed the papers that bound her to a stranger. She had told him it was fine. She had told him she did not mind. She had lied. Now, sitting in a house that did not want her, married to a man who had already dismissed her before their marriage had truly begun, Alara made herself a quiet promise. She would give him nothing to pity and nothing to regret gently. If he wanted her gone, she would go, but not before he understood exactly what he had thrown away. The following morning, Rothvane Manor buzzed with the usual quiet efficiency of a great house. Servants moved through the halls with trays and linens, the housekeeper barked soft instructions near the kitchen, and the winter sun spilled thin light across the marble floors. Alara descended the staircase dressed simply, her hair pinned back, her expression unreadable. She found Alastair in the breakfast room, a newspaper open in front of him, a cup of coffee untouched at his elbow. He glanced up when she entered, and for a brief moment something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, that she had not stayed hidden in her chambers nursing wounded pride. "Good morning," Alara said, taking a seat across from him as though the previous night had never happened. "Good morning," he replied, his voice cautious. She poured herself tea and buttered a piece of toast, and for several minutes neither of them spoke. The silence was not comfortable, but it was not unbearable either. Alara had decided, somewhere between midnight and dawn, that she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her wounded. If he wanted a business arrangement, she would treat it as exactly that, nothing more, nothing less. I trust the staff have made your rooms comfortable, Alastair said eventually, folding his newspaper. They have, Alara answered, though I imagine comfort was never truly the concern here. His jaw tightened slightly. Alara. You needn't explain yourself, Your Grace. She used the title deliberately, a small wall built between them with two simple words. You were clear about your expectations. I intend to honor the arrangement exactly as you described it. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was being sincere or simply proud. Whatever he saw in her face, he chose not to press further. He rose from the table, straightened his coat, and excused himself to attend to estate matters, leaving Alara alone with her tea and the quiet ticking of a grand clock in the hallway. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not, and she intended to keep that promise the same way she intended to keep every other one she made from that day forward completely, and without apology. Over the following weeks, a strange rhythm settled over the household. Alastair spent his days buried in ledgers and correspondence, rarely appearing except at meals, and even then his conversation was limited to polite, distant remarks about the weather or the state of the roads. Alara, for her part, used the time to observe. She watched the way the servants moved, learned their names, listened to the quiet gossip that traveled through the halls the way it always did in houses with too many secrets and too few distractions. She learned, for instance, that Alastair's mother had died young, and that his father had been a hard, unfeeling man who ruled the estate through fear rather than respect. She learned that Alastair had inherited the title far earlier than expected, thrust into responsibility before he had time to grieve properly. None of this excused his cruelty, but it gave her something to think about in the quiet hours when sleep would not come. She also learned, through careful and patient inquiry, that the Rothvane estate was not as secure as its grand appearance suggested. There were debts hidden beneath the polished surface, obligations that had been quietly accumulating for years. Alastair guarded this information closely, but Alara had grown up watching her own father struggle with similar burdens, and she recognized the signs immediately: the tension in his shoulders when certain letters arrived, the way he sometimes locked himself in his study for hours without explanation. She said nothing of what she noticed, not yet. She simply watched and waited and grew more certain with each passing day that this marriage, however coldly it had begun, was not quite what it appeared to be on the surface. One evening, nearly a month after the wedding, Alara found herself walking through the gardens as the sun began to set, the sky painted in shades of amber and rose. She had always found comfort in gardens, ever since childhood, when her mother would take her walking among the roses and teach her the names of every flower they passed. Rothvane Manor's gardens were grander than anything she had known before, but they felt neglected somehow, as though no one had truly cared for them in years. She was kneeling beside a bed of wilted lavender, pulling away dead stems with careful fingers, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. You needn't trouble yourself with the gardens, Alastair said. There are servants for that. I know, Alara replied, not looking up. I simply find it peaceful. He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. You are not what I expected, he admitted finally, the words seeming to surprise even him as he said them. Alara sat back on her heels and looked up at him, her expression calm. And what did you expect, Your Grace? A weeping bride who would spend her days pleading for your affection. I was raised to understand duty. I do not require your kindness to fulfill my obligations. Something shifted in his expression, not quite guilt, but close to it. That is not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crouched beside her, his movements careful, as though unused to lowering himself to such a simple task. He picked up one of the dead lavender stems and turned it over in his fingers. I meant, he said slowly, that most people, when treated as I treated you, would show it. You show nothing. Perhaps I have simply learned not to give people the satisfaction, Alara said. Their eyes met, and for a brief, strange moment, something passed between them that neither of them could name, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, as though each had glimpsed something unexpected in the other. Then Alastair straightened, clearing his throat, retreating once more behind the careful distance he had built around himself since childhood. "I have matters to attend to," he said, and walked away without waiting for a response. Alara watched him go, her fingers still stained with soil, and allowed herself a small, private smile. He believed he had already broken her. He believed the arrangement was settled, that she would fulfill her duty and vanish quietly as instructed, leaving no trace behind. He did not yet understand that the woman kneeling in his neglected garden was not the type to disappear quietly from anything. She rose to her feet, brushed the dirt from her skirts, and looked out over the fading light settling across the estate. Whatever game Alastair Rothvin believed he was playing, Alara intended to make certain that by the time it ended, he would understand precisely what he had lost, and precisely what it meant to underestimate her. The wind picked up gently as she made her way back toward the manor, and for the first time since her wedding day, Alara felt something other than sorrow settle in her chest. It was resolve, sharp and steady, and it would carry her through everything that was still to come. 6 weeks after the wedding, word arrived that Alara was with child. The physician confirmed it on a gray morning, and when the news reached Alastair in his study, he simply nodded, thanked the man, and returned to his papers as though he had been informed of nothing more significant than a shipment of grain. Alara stood in the doorway and watched him for a long moment, waiting for some flicker of feeling to cross his face. There was none. "You have what you wanted," she said quietly. He looked up at her then, and for the briefest instant, something uncertain passed through his eyes. "Alara." "You needn't say anything further, Your Grace." This was the arrangement. She turned before he could see whatever expression had settled on her own face, and walked away with her spine straight and her steps unhurried. The months that followed were strange ones. Alara's body changed, her strength tested in ways she had never known, yet she carried herself through it with the same quiet determination that had guided her since her wedding night. Alastair, to her surprise, did not vanish entirely from her life during this time. He appeared at meals more often. He asked, stiffly but sincerely, whether she needed anything. Once she found a small collection of books left outside her door, novels she had mentioned enjoying in passing conversation weeks earlier. He never admitted to leaving them, and she never asked. She told herself it meant nothing. A man could be dutiful without being kind, attentive without caring. She had built her resolve on the promise of his own words, spoken plainly on their wedding night, and she refused to let small gestures soften what he had made so clear from the very beginning. He wanted an heir. He wanted her gone. She intended to give him exactly what he asked for, in exactly the order he requested it. The child, a daughter, was born on a cold morning in early spring. Alara named her Beatrice, after her own mother, and held the infant close as exhaustion, and something fiercer than exhaustion moved through her all at once. Alastair came to see them within the hour, standing awkwardly at the foot of the bed, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the small bundle in Alara's arms. "She is healthy?" he asked. "She is," Alara said. He nodded, and for a long moment he simply stood there, watching his daughter with an expression Alara could not read. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "She has your eyes." Alara said nothing. She did not trust her voice in that moment, and she was not willing to let him see whatever softness had crept into her heart at the sight of him standing there, uncertain and strangely gentle, looking at the child they had made together out of duty rather than love. The weeks that followed were quiet ones, filled with the small rituals of new motherhood. Alara nursed Beatrice through the night, walked her through the gardens during the day, and slowly began to feel the fog of exhaustion lift enough to think clearly about what came next. She had fulfilled her end of the arrangement. An heir had been given. The next step, according to the words spoken on her wedding night, was hers to take. She began, quietly and without announcement, to prepare for her departure. It was not a decision made in anger, though anger had certainly played its part in the beginning. It was, by the time she finally acted, a decision made with clear eyes and a steady heart. She would not stay in a house where she was tolerated rather than wanted. She would not raise her daughter believing that love was something to be earned through silent suffering. And she would not give Alastair Rothvane the satisfaction of watching her linger, hoping for affection he had never promised to give. She wrote to a distant cousin of her mother's, a woman named Margaret Voss, who had settled in the city of Belhaven many years earlier after marrying into trade rather than nobility. Margaret had always been considered something of a scandal by Alara's father's side of the family, a woman who had chosen independence and commerce over the safety of a titled match. Alara had met her only twice in childhood, but she remembered a woman full of warmth and sharp intelligence, someone who might understand exactly what Alara needed now. Margaret's reply came within a fortnight, warm and immediate, offering Alara a home for as long as she required one, no questions asked. Alara read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it away, feeling for the first time in months as though a door had opened somewhere in the darkness. She did not tell Alastair of her plans until the arrangements were nearly complete. She was not being cruel. She simply did not trust herself to remain steady if she gave him too much time to react, to argue, to perhaps even ask her to stay in a moment of weakness she would later regret believing. She found him in his study on a quiet evening, Beatrice asleep in the nursery, the household settling into its usual nighttime stillness. He looked up from his papers when she entered, and something in her expression must have told him what was coming, because he set down his pen slowly and gave her his full attention. "I am leaving," Alara said simply, "as you requested." For a long moment, Alastair said nothing at all. His face, usually so carefully composed, seemed to falter, though he recovered quickly, straightening in his chair and folding his hands atop his desk. "When?" he asked. "In 3 days' time." "And Beatrice?" "Comes with me." Alara's voice left no room for negotiation. "You made your terms clear on our wedding night, Your Grace. An heir and then my departure. I have given you the heir. I see no reason to leave my daughter behind in a house where her father cannot look at her, without calculating what she means to his legacy, rather than what she means to him." Alastair's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had known him, Alara saw something close to desperation flicker across his features. "That is not fair. She is my daughter as much as yours." "Fair," Alara repeated softly, almost to herself. "You wish to speak to me of fairness, after everything you said to me on the very night we were married." He had no answer for that. He simply sat there, silent, as the weight of his own words from months earlier settled over the room like a physical thing. "I am not doing this out of spite," Alara continued, her voice gentler now, though no less resolved. "I am doing this because I refuse to raise my daughter in a house that made me feel like a burden to be managed rather than a person to be valued. She deserves better than that. So do I." "Where will you go?" Alastair asked finally. "That is no longer your concern." She left the study without waiting for further argument, though she felt his eyes on her back the entire way down the hall. She did not look back. She had promised herself, months earlier, kneeling in the neglected garden with dirt beneath her fingernails, that she would not let this man see her break. She intended to keep that promise all the way to the door. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of quiet preparation. Alara packed only what belonged to her own clothing, a handful of books, the small collection of jewelry her mother had left her, and nothing that carried the Rothvane name or crest. She wanted no reminders of the house she was leaving behind, nothing that might tie her to a life she had never truly chosen for herself. The servants, to her surprise, seemed genuinely sorrowful to see her go. Several of the younger maids wept openly as they helped her prepare Beatrice's things, and even the stern old housekeeper pressed a small parcel of preserved fruit into her hands, muttering something about long journeys and empty stomachs. Alara had not expected to feel so much warmth from people she had known for less than a year, and it struck her, standing in the entrance hall on her final morning, that perhaps she had built more of a home in this house than she had realized, even if the man at its head had never truly let her in. Alastair did not appear to see her off. Alara told herself she was not disappointed, that she had expected nothing less from a man who had made his priorities so clear from the very beginning. She settled Beatrice into the carriage, wrapped warmly against the morning chill, and took one last look at the grand stone facade of Rothvane Manor before the driver signaled the horses forward. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Alara caught a glimpse of movement at an upper window. She could not be certain in the pale morning light, but she thought she saw a figure standing there, watching the carriage disappear into the distance, still and silent as a statue. She did not wave. She did not look back a second time. The journey to Belhaven took the better part of 4 days, winding through countryside that grew steadily less familiar with each passing mile. Alara spent the hours tending to Beatrice and staring out at the changing landscape, her mind turning over everything that had happened in the months since her wedding. She felt no regret for her decision, only a strange, hollow ache that she could not quite name, not sorrow exactly, but something adjacent to it, the sensation of closing a door on a chapter of her life she had never truly wanted to write. Margaret Voss met them at the edge of the city with an embrace so warm and immediate that Alara felt tears prick at her eyes for the first time in months. Margaret was older now than Alara remembered, silver threading through her dark hair, but her eyes held the same sharp warmth that Alara recalled from childhood. "You look tired, my dear," Margaret said, taking Beatrice gently into her arms and cooing softly at the baby's sleepy face. "But you are here now, and that is what matters. We will get you settled, and then we will decide what comes next." Alara followed her cousin through the bustling streets of Belhaven, a city unlike anything she had known before, full of merchants and traders, ships lining the harbor, the air thick with the scent of salt and spice and possibility. It was nothing like the quiet, controlled world of Rothvane Manor, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Alara felt something loosen in her chest. She did not know yet what her new life would look like. She did not know whether Alistair would attempt to reach her, or whether the arrangement they had made would truly hold as firmly as his cold words had promised. But she knew, walking through the crowded streets with her daughter safe in Margaret's arms, that she had made the right choice in leaving. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, not as a duchess discarded after fulfilling her duty, but as a woman finally free to build a life of her own choosing. The city stretched out before her, full of noise and color and the promise of something new, and Alara Whitmore walked into it with her head held high, leaving behind the ghost of the girl who had once believed that duty and sorrow were the only things marriage could offer her. Belhaven welcomed Alara the way the sea welcomes a ship it has not yet decided to trust. The city was loud and alive in ways she had never experienced, its harbor crowded with vessels from distant ports, its markets overflowing with goods and voices, and the constant hum of commerce. Margaret's home sat on a quiet street not far from the water, a modest but comfortable house filled with books, ledgers, and the pleasant clutter of a life built through work rather than inheritance. "You will stay as long as you need," Margaret told her on the first evening, once Beatrice had finally settled into an uneasy sleep in the small room they had prepared for her. "But I suspect, knowing your mother's spirit as I did, that you will not wish to stay idle for long." Alara managed a tired smile. "You knew my mother well." "Well enough to see her in you," Margaret said, pouring them both a cup of tea. She was the only one in that family who understood that a woman's worth was not measured by the size of the house she lived in, or the name attached to her marriage. I imagine that lesson has served you recently, though perhaps at great cost." Alara did not answer immediately. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup and stared into the amber liquid, memories of the past year settling heavily over her. "I do not regret leaving," she said finally, "but I would be lying if I said it did not cost me something." Margaret reached across the table and took her hand. "Cost is not the same as ruin, my dear. Remember that." Those words stayed with Alara through the difficult weeks that followed, the sleepless nights with Beatrice, the strange loneliness of a city where she knew almost no one, the quiet grief she still carried for a marriage that had never truly been permitted to become one. But slowly, gradually, the ache began to soften into something more manageable, and Alara found herself drawn increasingly toward Margaret's world of trade and enterprise. Margaret ran a modest but respected trading house, dealing primarily in imported textiles, fine silks, dyed wools, and delicate laces brought in from ports across the sea. She managed the business herself, having inherited it from her late husband, and refused every suggestion that she sell it off to a male relative who might run it properly. Alara found herself spending more and more time in the small office at the back of Margaret's warehouse, first out of curiosity, then out of genuine fascination. "You have a good eye," Margaret told her one afternoon, watching Alara examine a bolt of blue silk with careful, assessing fingers, "and a sharper mind for numbers than most of the men I employ. I spent a great deal of time watching my father struggle with his accounts," Alara admitted. "I suppose I learned mostly what mistakes to avoid." "Then perhaps it is time you learned what success looks like instead." It began small, helping Margaret review contracts, offering suggestions on pricing, learning the rhythms of the harbor and the ships that arrived each week loaded with goods from distant lands. Alara discovered, to her own quiet surprise, that she possessed a genuine talent for the work. She understood people, understood how to negotiate without alienating, how to spot a dishonest merchant from the particular way he avoided meeting her eyes. Within a few months, Margaret had begun entrusting her with real responsibilities, and within a year, Alara had become an essential part of the business rather than a guest simply passing through. She took a new name for her professional dealings, not out of shame but out of caution, Alara Heir, a name with no ties to the Rothvane title, no whisper of scandal or nobility attached to it. She did not wish to be known as a discarded duchess. She wished to be known, simply, as a woman who understood her trade. Beatrice grew quickly in those early years, a bright and curious child who filled the quiet house with laughter and endless questions. Alara raised her surrounded by warmth rather than duty, by people who chose to be present in her life rather than obligated to it. Margaret adored the girl fiercely, and the household staff, small as it was, treated Beatrice as though she belonged to all of them collectively. It was, Alara often thought in quiet moments, precisely the kind of home she had wished for herself as a child, one built on genuine affection rather than careful arrangement. She did not forget Alistair. She could not entirely, not when Beatrice's eyes held the same gray shade as her father's, not when certain quiet moments brought memories of the garden at Rothvane Manor rushing back unbidden. But she did not dwell on him either. She had built a life that did not require his presence to feel complete, and she intended to keep it that way. It was in her second year in Belhaven that Alara met Edmund Hale, a shipping merchant with a reputation for honest dealing in a trade often plagued by dishonesty. He arrived at the warehouse one autumn morning to discuss a contract for imported spices, and Alara found herself immediately struck by his easy manner, his genuine warmth, the way he spoke to Margaret's clerks with the same respect he showed to Margaret herself. "Mrs. Voss speaks highly of you," Edmund said, extending his hand toward Alara after their business had concluded. "She tells me you have quite the head for figures." "She flatters me," Alara replied, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "I doubt that," Edmund said. "Margaret Voss does not flatter anyone. It is not in her nature." Over the following months, Edmund became a regular presence in Alara's professional life, and slowly, cautiously, in her personal life as well. He never pressed her for details about her past, never asked why a woman with such evident refinement had settled in Belhaven under a name that did not quite match the careful way she carried herself. He simply treated her with steady kindness, the kind that asked nothing in return, and Alara found herself, against her own careful instincts, beginning to trust him. It was Edmund who first suggested that she consider establishing her own venture rather than remaining solely under Margaret's employ. "You have the skill for it," he told her one evening as they walked along the harbor, Beatrice skipping ahead of them chasing gulls. "And Belhaven has room for more than one successful woman in trade." "Margaret has given me everything," Alara said. "I would not wish to seem ungrateful." "Margaret would be the first to tell you that gratitude and ambition are not opposites," Edmund replied. "I suspect she is waiting for you to realize that yourself." He was right, as it turned out. When Alara finally worked up the courage to raise the idea with Margaret, her cousin's face broke into a wide, proud smile. "I wondered how long it would take you," Margaret said. "I have been saving a portion of the profits from your work these past 2 years, expecting exactly this conversation. Consider it an investment, not a gift. I expect to see returns." With Margaret's support and Edmund's guidance, Alara established her own small trading concern within the year, specializing in fine textiles imported from the eastern ports. A natural extension of the skills she had built under Margaret's tutelage, but entirely her own. She named the venture Whitmore Trading, using her maiden name rather than either the Rothvane title she had left behind or the Hale name she had adopted for anonymity. It felt, somehow, like reclaiming something that had always belonged to her. The business grew steadily. Alara possessed not only a sharp mind for numbers, but a genuine gift for understanding what people wanted before they knew it themselves. She traveled occasionally to inspect shipments personally, developed relationships with reliable suppliers across several distant ports, and slowly built a reputation throughout Belhaven as a shrewd, fair, and remarkably capable merchant. Within 3 years of her arrival in the city, Whitmore Trading had become one of the more respected textile houses along the harbor, and Alara Whitmore, though few in Belhaven knew her by any grander title, had become a woman of genuine standing in her own right. She thought, during those years, that she had left the world of nobility and duty behind entirely. She raised Beatrice with warmth and honesty, built a business through her own effort and intelligence, and surrounded herself with people who valued her for exactly who she was rather than what she could provide them. She allowed herself, cautiously, to imagine a future that did not involve the shadow of Rothvane Manor at all. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. It began with a letter, arriving one gray morning nearly 4 years after Alara had left the Rothvane estate. The seal was unmistakable, the crest of the Rothvane family, pressed into dark wax, the very symbol Alara had spent years trying to distance herself from. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, unsure what news could possibly warrant such correspondence after so much silence. The letter was not from Alastair himself, but from his aunt, Lady Margaret Fenwick, no relation to Alara's own Margaret, though the coincidence of names struck her briefly as she read. The letter was brief, formal, and carried an unmistakable undertone of urgency. The Duke, it explained, was facing significant difficulties. Rumors had begun circulating among the nobility regarding the stability of the Rothvane estate, whispers of debts far greater than anyone had previously understood, and questions regarding the legitimacy of certain financial dealings undertaken in the years since Alara's departure. More troubling still, distant relatives with claims to the title had begun circling, sensing weakness, preparing to challenge Alastair's position should the rumors prove true. The letter ended with a request Alara had not expected. Lady Fenwick was asking her to return, if only briefly, to help stabilize the situation, not for Alastair's sake, the letter clarified carefully, but for Beatrice's. As the Duke's only legitimate heir, Beatrice's future security depended on the estate's continued stability. Should the challenges against Alastair succeed, both his position and Beatrice's eventual inheritance could be lost entirely. Alara read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her desk, her mind racing through implications she had not considered in years. She had built a life entirely separate from Rothvane Manor, a life she was fiercely proud of, a life that asked nothing of the man who had once dismissed her so coldly. The idea of returning, even briefly, sent a cold unease settling through her chest. And yet, Beatrice's future was not something she could simply set aside. She sat with the letter for several days before mentioning it to anyone. When she finally showed it to Margaret, her cousin's expression grew serious, all traces of her usual warmth replaced by careful consideration. "You do not owe him anything," Margaret said firmly. "Whatever difficulties he faces, he built them through his own choices, or through the choices of those around him. You are not obligated to ride to his rescue simply because his aunt has requested it. I know, Alara said quietly. But Beatrice is. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, understanding, perhaps better than anyone, exactly the weight of that single word. What will you do? She asked finally. Alara looked out the window toward the harbor, watching the ships rock gently against their moorings, the same harbor that had welcomed her 4 years earlier when she had arrived with nothing but a sleeping infant and a fierce determination to build something new. She thought of the girl she had been on her wedding night, humiliated and dismissed, and the woman she had become since capable, respected, entirely her own person. I will go, she said finally, but not as the woman who left. I will go as Alara Whitmore of Whitmore Trading, and if Alastair Rothvane wishes my help, he will find that the terms of our arrangement have changed considerably since the last time we spoke. Margaret's mouth curved into a slow, approving smile. Now that, she said, sounds like your mother's daughter. That evening, as Alara sat writing her response to Lady Fenwick, carefully outlining the conditions under which she would consider returning, she felt something she had not expected, not dread, but a quiet, steady sense of purpose. Whatever awaited her at Rothvane Manor, whatever had become of the man who had once told her to give him an heir and disappear, she would face it not as the woman he had discarded, but as the woman she had become in his absence. Edmund found her still awake late that night, the letter finished and sealed on the desk before her, a single candle burning low beside it. You are truly going, then, he said, settling into the chair across from her. I am. And when you return, what will you tell him, about the years he has missed? Alara considered the question for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the sealed letter. I will tell him nothing, she said finally. I will simply let him see. Outside, the harbor lights flickered against the dark water, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in a manner she had once fled without looking back, a man who had spoken careless words on his wedding night was about to learn exactly what those words had cost him. In the years after Alara's departure, Rothvane Manor grew quieter in ways that had nothing to do with the absence of noise. The halls still echoed with the footsteps of servants, the clatter of dishes at mealtimes, the distant sound of horses in the stable yard, yet something essential had gone missing from the house, and Alastair felt its absence in every room he entered. He told himself in those first months that the quiet suited him. He had never wanted a wife underfoot, never wanted the complications of affection or partnership that came with a genuine marriage. He had married for duty, secured his heir, and released Alara exactly as he had promised on their wedding night. There was nothing to regret in fulfilling one's own stated intentions. And yet, the estate's ledgers, which he had always managed himself with a confidence bordering on arrogance, began to reveal problems he had not fully appreciated before. His father, in the final years before his death, had taken on debts far greater than Alastair had realized, loans against future harvests, investments in trading ventures that had failed to materialize, obligations to distant relatives that had never been properly settled. Alastair had inherited not just a title, but a slowly sinking foundation, and without Alara's quiet observations at breakfast, her occasional careful questions about certain expenditures, he found himself navigating the estate's finances with far less clarity than he had assumed he possessed. He did not realize in those early months how much he had come to rely on her presence, not for affection, he told himself firmly, but simply for the steadiness she brought to the household. Meals felt strange without her measured conversation. The gardens, which she had begun tending with such quiet care, fell back into neglect within weeks of her leaving, the lavender she had rescued withering once more without her attention. His aunt, Lady Margaret Fenwick, visited within the first year and did not hesitate to voice her disapproval. You have made a grave error, Alastair, she told him bluntly, settling into the drawing room with the air of a woman who had never once softened her opinions for anyone's comfort. A wife is not simply a vessel for producing heirs. She is a partner in managing an estate such as this one, and you have thrown away a woman who, from what little I observed, possessed more sense than you have shown in the past 3 years combined. The arrangement was clear from the beginning, Alastair replied stiffly. She understood the terms. The terms, his aunt repeated, her tone thick with disdain. You speak of your marriage as though it were a shipping contract. Tell me, nephew, has this cold arrangement of yours brought you any peace? He had no answer for that. He simply stared into his teacup, unwilling to admit, even to himself, that peace had grown increasingly elusive since the morning Alara's carriage had disappeared down the long gravel drive. The difficulties compounded gradually, then suddenly, the way debts often do. A poor harvest in the second year strained resources further. A trusted steward, entrusted with managing several of the estate's tenant farms, was discovered to have been embezzling funds for years, leaving Alastair to untangle a web of falsified records that took months to fully understand. Distant cousins, sensing the estate's mounting troubles, began making quiet inquiries about the succession, testing the waters to see whether Alastair's position remained as secure as it had once appeared. Chief among these relatives was Nathaniel Cross, a cousin twice removed who had long harbored ambitions toward the Rothvane title, believing his own claim, though distant, carried more legitimate weight than Alastair's given the circumstances of his birth. Nathaniel began cultivating relationships among the other noble families, spreading careful, deniable whispers about the state of Rothvane finances, about the absence of a duchess to properly manage household affairs, about whether a man who had so carelessly discarded his own wife could truly be trusted to steward an entire estate. Alastair heard these rumors secondhand, filtered through the careful reports of loyal servants and the occasional pointed comment from acquaintances at social gatherings he increasingly avoided. He told himself the rumors carried no real weight, that his position was secure regardless of what idle gossip suggested. But as the third year passed into the fourth, and the estate's financial troubles grew harder to conceal, he began to understand with mounting unease that Nathaniel's whispers were finding fertile ground. It was during this period that Alastair began, quietly and without admitting it even to himself, to think of Alara more often than he intended to. He wondered where she had gone, whether she had found happiness, whether Beatrice, his daughter, whom he had seen only briefly before her mother carried her away, had grown into the bright, curious child he had glimpsed in her infant features. He kept, though he told no one, the small collection of correspondence Alara had left behind, letters exchanged with tradespeople and household suppliers, simply because they carried traces of her careful, decisive handwriting. He did not write to her. Pride and something closer to shame kept him from putting pen to paper for years, even as circumstances at the estate grew increasingly desperate. It was his aunt, finally, who took matters into her own hands. You will destroy this entire estate through your own stubbornness, Lady Fenwick told him during a particularly tense visit in the fourth year, after Nathaniel Cross had begun openly courting support from several influential families for a formal challenge to Alastair's position. You need someone who understands finances, who commands respect, who can stand beside you and remind these vultures circling the estate that the Rothvane name still carries strength. And I know precisely such a person. I will not beg Alara to return, Alastair said, his voice tight with a mixture of pride and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. No one is asking you to beg, his aunt replied sharply. I am simply informing you that I intend to write to her myself, and you will not interfere. Beatrice's inheritance is at stake here, nephew, regardless of your wounded pride. If you cannot set that aside for the sake of your own daughter's future, then perhaps Nathaniel Cross deserves this title more than you do. The words stung precisely because Alastair suspected they carried truth. He said nothing to stop his aunt from writing the letter, though the days that followed her departure were filled with a restless, uncomfortable anticipation he did not fully understand. He told himself he wanted Alara's return purely for practical reasons. Her sharp mind for figures, her ability to calm anxious tenants and skeptical creditors, her steady presence that had somehow, without his fully realizing it, become essential to the smooth operation of the household. He told himself many things in those anxious weeks of waiting, and believed perhaps half of them. When word finally arrived that Alara had agreed to return, Alastair felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settle over him. He had spent 4 years telling himself that her absence meant nothing, that the arrangement had concluded exactly as intended, that he required nothing from her beyond the heir she had already provided. Now, faced with the reality of her return, he found himself uncertain what to expect, uncertain, too, of what he truly wanted from the woman he had once dismissed so coldly. He ordered the household prepared for her arrival with a level of attention that surprised even his most senior staff. The gardens, neglected for years, were hastily tended, though the lavender beds she had once rescued could not be restored in time. Her former chambers were aired and refreshed. The kitchens prepared meals with unusual care, as though the entire household understood, without needing to be told, that the woman returning to Rothvane Manor was not the same one who had left it. Alastair stood at the window of his study on the morning she was expected, watching the long gravel drive with an anxiety he had not felt since the earliest days of managing the estate alone. He did not know what version of Alara would step from that carriage, whether she would arrive cold and businesslike, fulfilling only the minimum obligations necessary to secure Beatrice's future, or whether some trace remained of the woman who had once knelt beside him in the garden, dirt beneath her fingernails, speaking to him with a directness no one else in his life had ever offered. He suspected, deep down, that whichever version arrived, he was no longer the same man who had once told her, so carelessly, to give him an heir and disappear. The years since her departure had stripped away much of his arrogance, replaced it with a harder-won understanding of exactly what he had lost. Whether that understanding had come too late remained to be seen. The carriage appeared at the end of the drive precisely as the church bells in the distant village struck noon, and Alastair felt his breath catch in his throat as it drew steadily closer, carrying toward him a woman he had spent 4 years trying, and failing, to forget. The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the manor, and for a long moment nothing happened at all. Alastair stood on the front steps, flanked by his aunt and the assembled household staff, watching the door of the carriage with an intensity that made his aunt glance at him sideways, a knowing look crossing her weathered face. Then the door opened, and Alara stepped down onto the gravel drive. She looked, Alastair thought immediately, nothing like the woman who had left 4 years earlier. She still carried herself with the same quiet composure, the same careful grace, but there was a new confidence in the set of her shoulders, a sharpness in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had built something entirely of her own making. She wore a traveling dress of deep green, simple but well-tailored, and her dark hair was styled in a manner Alastair did not recognize, practical yet elegant. Behind her, a small girl climbed down from the carriage with the assistance of a footman, her curious gray eyes taking in the grand facade of Rothvane Manor for what was, to her, likely the first memory of the place she had once briefly called home. Alastair's breath caught at the sight of her. Beatrice had grown from an infant into a bright-eyed child of 4, her dark curls framing a face that carried unmistakable traces of both her parents. She looked up at the manor with open curiosity rather than fear, and something in Alastair's chest tightened painfully at the realization of how much of her life he had missed. "Your Grace," Alara said, her voice carrying across the drive with perfect, practiced formality. There was no warmth in the greeting, no trace of the woman who had once spoken to him with unguarded directness in the garden. This was a stranger's greeting, polite and distant, and Alastair felt the sting of it more sharply than he had expected. "Alara," he replied, deliberately choosing her name over the title she had offered him. "Thank you for coming." "I came for Beatrice's sake," she said simply. "Let us be clear about that from the beginning." Lady Fenwick stepped forward before the tension could stretch any further, greeting Alara with genuine warmth, and immediately turning her attention to Beatrice, exclaiming over how much the girl had grown, how clearly bright and curious she appeared. The small distraction gave Alastair a moment to collect himself, though his eyes remained fixed on Alara throughout, cataloging every change 4 years had wrought. She had grown harder to read, he realized. Where once he had at least occasionally glimpsed genuine emotion beneath her careful composure, now she presented an almost impenetrable surface, polite and professional, revealing nothing of whatever she truly felt standing once more on the grounds of the house she had fled with such quiet determination. "I have arranged rooms for you and Beatrice," Alastair said as the group moved toward the entrance. "The same chambers you occupied previously, if that is agreeable." "It is fine," Alara said, though something flickered briefly across her expression at the mention of her former rooms, memory, perhaps, or simply resignation. They settled into an uneasy routine over the following days. Alara, true to the careful conditions she had outlined in her correspondence with Lady Fenwick, immersed herself immediately in the estate's financial troubles, reviewing ledgers with the same sharp, practical eye that had built Whitmore Trading into a respected enterprise in Belhaven. Alastair found himself, more than once, standing in the doorway of his own study watching her work, struck by how completely she had transformed since their marriage. No longer a young woman uncertain of her place, but a capable businesswoman who understood figures and negotiations with a confidence that rivaled, and often exceeded, his own. Your steward's embezzlement went undetected for years because no one thought to cross-reference the tenant payment records against the actual harvest yields, Alara told him on her third evening at the estate, spreading several ledgers across his desk with brisk efficiency. The discrepancies are subtle, but they are there, consistently, across nearly every quarter for the past 6 years. Alastair studied the figures she indicated, genuinely impressed despite the tension still simmering beneath their every interaction. "You have grown remarkably skilled with accounts," he said. "I run a trading company," Alara replied simply. "Skill with accounts is somewhat essential to survival in that trade." "Whitmore Trading," Alastair said, and something in his tone made Alara glance up sharply. "My aunt mentioned it in her correspondence. It seems you have built quite the reputation in Belhaven." "I built it myself," Alara said, a note of pride entering her voice despite her evident effort to remain composed. "Without assistance from any titled family." The words landed exactly as she had intended them to, and Alastair absorbed the quiet rebuke without protest. He deserved it, he knew, and arguing the point would only prove how little he had truly changed. Over the following weeks, as Alara worked to untangle the estate's financial troubles and prepare a defense against Nathaniel Cross's mounting challenge to the succession, Alastair found himself drawn increasingly into her orbit, seeking her counsel not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for her judgment. She approached each problem with the same clear-eyed practicality she had shown from their very first breakfast together. Years earlier, and Alastair began to understand, with growing discomfort, exactly how much he had thrown away when he had sent her from the estate so coldly. Beatrice, meanwhile, adjusted to life at Rothvane Manor with the easy adaptability of childhood, quickly charming the household staff, and more slowly, beginning to warm toward the father she barely remembered. Alastair spent what time he could with her, awkward at first, uncertain how to engage with a child he had missed so much of, but gradually finding his footing as Beatrice's natural curiosity drew him into games and stories and quiet afternoons in the gardens Alara had once tended. "She asks about you when you are not present," Alara told him one evening, finding him alone in the garden after Beatrice had been put to bed. "I have told her the truth, mostly, that circumstances kept us apart, that it was not her fault, that you care for her regardless of the distance between us." "Thank you," Alastair said quietly, "for not turning her against me when you would have had every right to." Alara was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the lavender beds that had finally, under careful new attention, begun to recover some of their former beauty. "I did not leave to punish you through her," she said finally. "I left because I refused to raise a child in a house where her mother was treated as disposable. That was never about revenge, Alastair. It was about survival." He flinched slightly at the directness of her words, though he did not look away. "I know that now," he said. "I did not understand it then. I was young and arrogant and grieving my father in ways I did not fully acknowledge, and I took that grief out on you in the cruelest way I could have chosen." "An explanation," Alara said, "is not the same as an apology." "Then let me offer both," Alastair said, turning to face her fully. "I am sorry, Alara, for every word I spoke to you on our wedding night and every silence that followed in the months after. I was wrong, in ways I am only beginning to fully understand." Alara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the fading evening light. "Apologies are easy to offer, Your Grace, particularly when circumstances have made my continued absence inconvenient to your interests." "I understand why you would think that," Alastair said, his voice steady despite the sting of her words. "But I am asking you to believe that my regret extends beyond mere convenience. I have thought of you every day since you left, Alara. Not simply because the estate suffered in your absence, though it certainly did, but because I understood, far too late, exactly what kind of woman I had dismissed." She did not respond immediately, and Alastair forced himself to remain patient, to allow her the space to process words that 4 years of careful distance had made necessary, but had not made easy to hear. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I did not come here for apologies," she said. "I came for Beatrice's future. Whatever regret you carry, Alastair, it does not undo the years already past, nor does it guarantee anything about the years still to come. I will help you secure the estate against Nathaniel Cross's challenge, because that serves my daughter's interests. Beyond that, I make no promises." "I understand," Alastair said, though something in his chest ached at the careful boundaries she had drawn between them. They stood together in the darkening garden for a long moment, the silence between them heavy with everything unsaid, everything that 4 years of separation had made both necessary and impossible to fully bridge in a single conversation. Eventually, Alara turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Alastair alone among the lavender beds she had once rescued from neglect, wondering whether the woman who had returned to Rothvane Manor might ever forgive the man he had once been, or whether some wounds, however sincerely regretted, simply could not be undone by words alone. The following days brought the practical business of confronting Nathaniel Cross's challenge into sharper focus. Alara, working closely with Alastair and his solicitors, uncovered further evidence of the steward's embezzlement, evidence that not only explained the estate's financial troubles, but also revealed connections between the dishonest steward and Nathaniel Cross himself. Quiet payments, carefully hidden, that suggested Nathaniel had been deliberately encouraging the estate's decline in order to strengthen his own claim to the title. "He has been undermining you for years," Alara told Alastair, spreading the evidence across his desk with the same sharp precision she brought to every task. "The embezzlement was not simply opportunistic theft. It was calculated sabotage, designed to weaken your position while Nathaniel built support among the other noble families for his own succession." Alastair studied the documents with growing anger, understanding now the full scope of the scheme that had nearly cost him everything. "How did you uncover this so quickly? My own solicitors spent months on these accounts without finding this connection." "Your solicitors were looking for simple theft," Alara said. "I was looking for pattern. In trade, you learn quickly that the most dangerous competitors are rarely the obvious ones. They hide behind layers of misdirection, and you only find them by asking who benefits most from confusion." Alastair looked up at her, genuine admiration mixing with something warmer that he was increasingly unable to suppress. "You have saved this estate, Alara. Not simply provided an heir to it, as I once so carelessly demanded, but saved it entirely, through your own skill and determination." "I saved Beatrice's inheritance," Alara corrected gently, though her expression softened slightly at his words. "Do not mistake practical necessity for anything more sentimental than that." But even as she spoke the careful correction, Alastair noticed something in her eyes that suggested the boundaries she had drawn between them, however firmly stated, were not quite as absolute as her words implied. Whatever remained unresolved between them, 4 years of separation had not entirely erased the connection that had first flickered to life in a neglected garden, dirt beneath careful fingers, two people slowly, cautiously beginning to see each other clearly for the very first time. News of the evidence against Nathaniel Cross spread quickly once Alastair's solicitors formally presented it to the Council of Noble Families overseeing succession disputes. Nathaniel, confronted with proof of his years-long scheme, did not go quietly. He arrived at Rothvane Manor unannounced on a blustery afternoon, his composure cracking at the edges as he demanded to speak with Alastair directly. Alara was in the study reviewing correspondence when the commotion began in the entrance hall, Nathaniel's raised voice carrying clearly through the closed door. She rose immediately, some instinct telling her that Alastair would need steady support rather than solitary confrontation, and made her way toward the hall with quick, purposeful steps. "You cannot simply destroy years of careful work with a handful of documents," Nathaniel was saying as she arrived, his face flushed with anger and something closer to panic. "The Council will see this for what it is, a desperate attempt to discredit a legitimate claim." "The Council will see it for exactly what it is," Alastair replied, his voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "Clear evidence that you conspired with my former steward to embezzle funds and sabotage this estate's stability, all in service of strengthening your own succession claim. There is nothing legitimate about deliberately weakening a rival through theft and deception, Nathaniel." "I did what was necessary," Nathaniel snapped, his careful composure finally abandoning him entirely. "You were never fit to hold this title, Alastair. Everyone knew it, from the moment you inherited it far too young, from a father who himself nearly ran this estate into ruin through his own poor judgment. I simply accelerated an outcome that was always inevitable." Alara stepped forward then, her presence drawing Nathaniel's attention for the first time since her arrival in the hall. "Inevitable," she repeated, her voice carrying the same cool precision she used when negotiating difficult contracts in Belhaven. "How curious, then, that this inevitable ruin required years of carefully concealed theft to actually manifest. Tell me, Mr. Cross, does inevitability typically require quite so much active assistance?" Nathaniel's eyes narrowed as he took in her calm, unwavering presence. "Ah, the Duchess returns," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "How convenient that you arrived just in time to help salvage your daughter's inheritance. I wonder, does genuine loyalty motivate you, or simply the recognition of where your own interests now lie?" "My interests," Alara said, unmoved by his attempt at provocation, "lie in ensuring that a man who deliberately sabotaged an entire estate through theft and deception does not profit from his own criminal conduct. That is not complicated loyalty, Mr. Cross. That is simply justice." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might continue arguing, but something in Alara's steady, unflinching gaze seemed to deflate his remaining bravado. He turned back to Alastair instead, his voice quieter now, though no less bitter. "This is not finished," he said. "The Council may rule in your favor today, but reputations, once damaged, are not so easily repaired. People will remember what nearly happened here, regardless of how this particular dispute concludes." "Perhaps," Alastair replied evenly. "But they will also remember that you were the one who nearly destroyed this estate through greed and deception, rather than any genuine claim to legitimacy. I suspect that memory will follow you rather more persistently than it follows me." Nathaniel left shortly after, his carriage disappearing down the drive with considerably less confidence than it had arrived with, and the household settled into an uneasy quiet in the aftermath of the confrontation. Alastair found Alara later that evening in the small library adjoining his study, a book open in her lap though her attention seemed elsewhere, her mind clearly still turning over the events of the day. "Thank you," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "for standing beside me this afternoon. You did not have to." "I did not do it for you," Alara said, though her tone lacked the sharp edge it had carried in earlier conversations. "I did it because Nathaniel Cross is precisely the kind of man who believes cruelty and manipulation are simply the cost of ambition. I have encountered men like him before in trade. They rarely stop unless directly confronted. Even so, Alastair said, I am grateful. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling gently in the hearth, before Alara finally spoke again, her voice more hesitant than Alastair had heard it since her return. There is something else you should know, she said. Something I uncovered while reviewing the older estate records, searching for evidence of the embezzlement pattern. Alastair straightened slightly, sensing the seriousness in her tone. What is it? Your father, Alara said carefully, did not simply mismanage the estate's finances through poor judgment, as everyone has always assumed. I found correspondence, buried among the older records, suggesting he deliberately entered into several disastrous investments at the urging of a business partner who profited enormously from the estate's subsequent losses. Alastair felt something cold settle in his chest. Who was this partner? Alara hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver news she knew would land heavily. The correspondence identifies him only by initials, but the pattern of the transactions and certain other details I have cross-referenced strongly suggest the partner was Nathaniel Cross's own father. The revelation settled over the room like a physical weight. Alastair sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the implications, that the financial troubles which had plagued the estate for years, troubles he had always attributed to his father's poor judgment alone, had in fact been deliberately engineered by the very family now attempting to claim the title through exploitation of that manufactured weakness. 2 generations, Alastair said finally, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and something closer to grief. 2 generations of the Cross family working to undermine this estate, all in pursuit of a title they were never rightfully entitled to. It would seem so, Alara said quietly. I am sorry, Alastair. I know this cannot be an easy thing to learn about your father, particularly given how complicated your feelings toward him already were. Alastair looked up at her, surprised by the gentleness in her voice, the genuine sympathy that seemed to have replaced, at least momentarily, the careful distance she had maintained since her return. You remember that I struggled with my feelings toward him. I remember many things, Alara said, from the months we spent together before I left. You spoke of him rarely, but when you did, I could see how much unresolved grief remained beneath your careful composure. I did not forget that, even during the years we spent apart. Something shifted between them in that quiet moment, a fragile thread of understanding reasserting itself after years of careful distance. Alastair reached across the small space separating their chairs, hesitating only briefly before taking her hand in his. I do not deserve your continued kindness, he said quietly, after everything I put you through, but I find myself grateful for it regardless. Alara did not pull her hand away, though she did not respond immediately either, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of emotions that Alastair could not fully interpret. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but steady. I am not offering kindness out of forgiveness, Alastair. Not yet, at least. I am simply recognizing that grief, however complicated its origins, deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. You taught me that lesson yourself in the cruelest possible way when you dismissed my own feelings so completely on the night we married. The words carried a quiet sting, but Alastair accepted them without protest, understanding that whatever progress they had made toward rebuilding trust remained fragile, easily shattered by careless words or premature assumptions. He released her hand gently, allowing the moment to settle rather than pushing for more than she was prepared to offer. Over the following days, the full truth of Nathaniel Cross's family scheme came to light before the Council of Noble Families, thoroughly documented through the evidence Alara had uncovered. The council ruled decisively in Alastair's favor, formally dismissing Nathaniel's succession challenge, and, in a rare additional measure, imposing significant penalties against the Cross family for their documented history of financial sabotage, spanning 2 generations. The victory should have brought Alastair unambiguous relief, and in many ways it did, the estate's future secured, Beatrice's eventual inheritance protected. The shadow of scandal finally lifted after years of mounting anxiety. But alongside that relief sat a quieter, more persistent uncertainty regarding his relationship with Alara, who had accomplished everything she had promised, securing the estate, protecting Beatrice's future, while carefully maintaining the boundaries she had established upon her return. "You have fulfilled your promise," Alastair told her one evening, shortly after the council's ruling had been finalized. "The estate is secure. Beatrice's inheritance is protected. I imagine you will wish to return to Belhaven soon, to the life and business you have built there." Alara was quiet for a long moment, her expression difficult to read in the flickering candlelight. "I imagine I should," she said finally, though something in her voice suggested less certainty than her words implied. "Should," Alastair repeated carefully, "is not quite the same as will." Alara looked up at him then, her eyes carrying an expression he had not seen from her since the earliest, most fragile days of their original marriage, uncertainty, mixed with something that might cautiously have been hope. "I do not know what I want, Alastair," she admitted quietly. "I built an entire life for myself in Belhaven, a life I am genuinely proud of, built through my own effort rather than any inherited privilege. I am not certain I am prepared to abandon that, even for the sake of whatever remains unresolved between us." "I would never ask you to abandon it," Alastair said firmly. "Whatever happens between us, Alara, I will not repeat the mistake of treating your ambitions as something to be discarded for my own convenience. If anything remains possible between us, it must be built on equal footing, with your independence fully respected rather than merely tolerated." Alara studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of the careless arrogance that had defined him on their wedding night, years earlier. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, at least partially, because the careful distance in her eyes softened slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful, more open to possibility than she had allowed herself to be since her return. "Perhaps," she said finally, "we should discuss what equal footing might actually look like, before either of us makes assumptions about what remains possible." It was not a promise, not yet, but it was more than Alastair had dared to hope for in the days since her arrival, and he found himself, for the first time in years, allowing genuine hope to take root alongside the relief of the estate's secured future. The conversation Alara had promised did not happen immediately. She needed time, she explained to Alastair, to think clearly about what she truly wanted, separate from the relief of the estate's secured future, and separate from whatever complicated feelings lingered between them from years earlier. Alastair, understanding the weight of what he was asking her to consider, gave her that time without pressing further, though the waiting tested his patience more than he cared to admit. It was nearly 2 weeks after the council's ruling when Alara finally approached him, finding him in his study on a quiet evening, Beatrice already asleep upstairs, the household settling into its familiar nighttime stillness. She carried herself with the same careful composure she had maintained since her return, but there was something different in her bearing this time, a deliberateness that suggested she had arrived with a clear purpose rather than simply drifting into conversation. "I have thought carefully about what you said," she began, settling into the chair across from his desk without waiting for invitation. "About equal footing, about what remains possible between us if anything does." Alastair set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "And what have you concluded?" "I have concluded that before we discuss any future together, you must first fully understand exactly what you did to me on our wedding night, and in the months that followed," Alara said, her voice steady but carrying an edge Alastair had not heard from her since her return. "Not simply acknowledge it in vague terms as you have done, but truly understand it." "Then help me understand," Alastair said quietly. "I am listening." Alara studied him for a long moment before continuing, as though testing whether his invitation carried genuine sincerity or merely polite deflection. Apparently satisfied, she began speaking, her words measured but carrying years of carefully contained emotion finally finding release. "When you told me to give you an heir and disappear on the very night we were married, you did not simply wound my pride," she said. You told me, in the clearest possible terms, that my entire existence held value only insofar as it served your practical needs. Not my thoughts, not my company, not even my presence in the life of the child we would eventually create together. Simply my usefulness in producing an heir, after which I was to vanish as though I had never existed at all. Alastair absorbed her words without interrupting, understanding that whatever he might wish to say in his own defense would only diminish the importance of truly hearing what she needed to express. I spent that entire night, Alara continued, convincing myself that I could survive such treatment without breaking, that I could build something of value for myself regardless of how little value you assigned me. And I did survive it, Alastair. I built an entire life in Belhaven, a business, a home, a place for Beatrice to grow up surrounded by genuine warmth rather than cold obligation. I did all of that without you, and I want you to understand clearly that I do not regret a single moment of the life I built in your absence. I understand that, Alastair said quietly. I have watched you these past weeks, Alara. I have seen exactly what kind of woman you became, and I recognize fully that it was built despite my cruelty, not because of any support I offered. Then you must also understand, Alara said, that I will not simply return to being your wife because circumstances have once again made my presence convenient. If anything is to exist between us going forward, it must be built on entirely different terms than the ones you established on our wedding night. Name them, Alastair said. Whatever terms you require, I am prepared to hear them. Alara took a steadying breath before continuing, and Alastair could see, beneath her careful composure, that this conversation cost her something significant to have years of guarded independence being cautiously, deliberately set aside in favor of genuine vulnerability. First, she said, I will not abandon Whitmore Trading. Whatever happens between us, that business remains entirely mine, built through my own effort, and I will continue managing it regardless of where I ultimately reside. If that means dividing my time between Belhaven and Rothvane Manor, then that is the arrangement you must accept. Agreed, Alastair said immediately without hesitation. Second, Alara continued, Beatrice will be raised knowing both her parents fully, not simply tolerating occasional visits from a distant father who values her only as an heir to a title. If you wish to be part of her life, you must be genuinely present in it, consistently, not merely when convenient to your own interests. I intend to be, Alastair said. I have already begun trying these past weeks. I recognize I have years to make up for, and I do not expect that debt to be settled quickly. Third, Alara said, her voice softening slightly, though no less firm, if we are to attempt any genuine partnership between us, it must be built on honesty from this moment forward. No more careless words spoken without consideration for their weight. No more decisions made unilaterally, without regard for what I might want or need. I have spent 4 years being the sole architect of my own life, Alastair, and I will not surrender that agency simply because we share a daughter and a complicated history. Alastair rose from his desk and moved to kneel beside her chair, an act of deliberate humility that seemed to surprise Alara, given the careful distance he had maintained since her return. I accept every condition you have named, he said, and I offer one of my own, though it is less a condition than a confession. I do not simply wish for a practical partnership built on convenience and mutual obligation, Alara. In the years since you left, I came to understand that what I lost was not merely a capable wife who managed the household efficiently. I lost the only person who ever truly challenged me to become better than the arrogant, grieving young man I was when we married. I do not know if genuine affection can be rebuilt after everything that passed between us, but I am asking, humbly, for the chance to try. Alara's careful composure faltered slightly at his words, years of guarded distance finally showing cracks beneath the weight of his sincerity. You are asking a great deal, she said quietly, for a man who once dismissed me so completely. I know, Alastair said, and I do not expect you to answer tonight or even this week. I am simply asking you to allow the possibility to exist, rather than closing the door entirely before we have truly tested whether something genuine might grow between us now, on terms that honor exactly who you have become. They sat together in the quiet study for a long time after that, the fire burning low in the hearth, neither of them speaking further, both simply absorbing the weight of everything that had finally been said between them after years of careful silence. When Alara finally rose to retire for the evening, she paused at the doorway, looking back at Alistair with an expression that carried, for the first time since her return, genuine warmth rather than careful distance. "I will consider it," she said softly. "But you must understand, Alistair, that trust rebuilt slowly is worth infinitely more than trust rushed carelessly. Do not expect quick forgiveness simply because you have finally offered genuine words instead of careless ones." "I would not dare to expect anything," Alistair replied. "I am simply grateful for the chance to earn it." She left him then, and Alistair remained alone in his study for a long while afterward, staring into the dying fire, allowing himself to feel, for the first time in years, something that resembled genuine hope rather than simple relief. The path ahead remained uncertain, the wounds of their past far from fully healed, but for the first time since the cold, careless words he had spoken on their wedding night, Alistair Rothvane allowed himself to believe that redemption, however difficult to earn, remained genuinely possible. The weeks that followed brought small, deliberate changes to the rhythm of life at Rothvane Manor. Alistair began joining Alara and Beatrice for breakfast each morning, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire for their company. He asked Alara's opinion on estate matters not as a formality, but as genuine consultation, valuing her judgment as an equal partner rather than a temporary asset brought in to solve a crisis. He spent afternoons in the garden with Beatrice, learning the names of flowers alongside his daughter, slowly rebuilding a relationship that 4 years of absence had left fragile and uncertain. Alara, for her part, allowed herself, cautiously, to soften. She did not abandon the careful boundaries she had established, did not surrender the independence she had built so deliberately in Belhaven, but she began, slowly, to trust the genuine effort Alistair demonstrated with each passing day. Small moments accumulated between them, shared laughter over Beatrice's stubborn refusal to eat vegetables, quiet evenings discussing estate matters that gradually stretched into conversations about everything and nothing, the tentative rebuilding of a connection neither of them had fully believed possible after everything that had passed between them. It was not, Alara reminded herself often during those weeks, a guarantee of anything permanent. Trust rebuilt after such profound betrayal remained fragile, easily damaged by careless words or broken promises. But for the first time since the cold, humiliating words spoken on her wedding night, she allowed herself to imagine a future with Alistair Rothvane that did not require her own diminishment to exist. A future built on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and the hard-won understanding that love, if it existed between them at all, would need to be earned through consistent action rather than assumed through mere obligation. Just when it seemed the worst of their troubles had passed, a new threat emerged, one final desperate act from a man unwilling to accept the complete collapse of his ambitions. Nathaniel Cross, stripped of his succession claim and facing significant financial penalties, had one card left to play, and he played it with the same calculated cruelty that had defined his earlier scheme. The first sign of trouble arrived in the form of an urgent letter from Margaret Voss, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the night to reach Rothvane Manor. Alara's hands trembled as she broke the seal, her earlier composure cracking the moment she scanned the contents. "What is it?" Alistair asked, watching her face grow pale as she read. "A shipment," Alara said, her voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "2 of my ships, carrying nearly a season's worth of imported silk, were seized at the Belhaven port under accusations of smuggling contraband goods. Margaret writes that the accusations came from an anonymous source, but the timing—" "Nathaniel," Alistair finished grimly. "It would ruin me," Alara said, the practical implications settling over her with cold clarity. Whitmore Trading cannot survive the loss of an entire season's shipment, particularly not while facing formal accusations of smuggling. Even if the charges are eventually proven false, the damage to my reputation among suppliers and buyers would be devastating. Alastair was already moving toward the door, calling for his solicitor and his fastest horses. "We leave for Belhaven within the hour," he said. "I will not allow Nathaniel Cross to destroy everything you built simply because he could not destroy me directly." The journey to Belhaven passed in a blur of urgent travel, Alara's mind racing through every possible defense against the accusations while Alastair rode alongside her. His own considerable resources and legal connections now fully committed to protecting not just his own estate, but the business she had built entirely independent of his name. It was, Alara realized somewhere during the long hours of travel, the first time Alastair had ever placed her interests above his own without hesitation or careful calculation of personal benefit. They arrived in Belhaven to find the situation exactly as dire as Margaret's letter had suggested. The port authorities, acting on the anonymous accusations, had impounded both ships and their entire cargo, and whispers of scandal had already begun spreading through the trading community, exactly as Nathaniel had clearly intended. Alara's competitors, sensing opportunity in her sudden vulnerability, wasted no time spreading further rumors, eager to see a successful rival woman merchant knocked down from her hard-won position. "We need evidence that the accusation itself is false," Alara said, meeting with Margaret and Edmund in the cramped office of Whitmore Trading, papers spread across every available surface as they worked through the crisis. The silk was purchased through entirely legitimate channels, properly documented at every stage. If we can prove the paper trail, the smuggling accusation collapses entirely. "That will take time we may not have," Edmund said grimly. "The port authorities are already discussing whether to bring formal charges, and every day the ships remain impounded costs you further in damaged goods and lost contracts." It was Alastair who suggested the solution, drawing on his own knowledge of legal proceedings and noble influence in ways he had never before applied to Alara's benefit. "I will personally vouch for the legitimacy of the shipment before the port magistrate," he said. "My name carries weight in matters of trade legitimacy, and I am prepared to stake my own reputation on the accuracy of Alara's documentation." "You would risk your own credibility for my business?" Alara asked, genuine surprise coloring her voice. "I would risk considerably more than that," Alastair said quietly, "for you." The following days brought a whirlwind of activity, legal proceedings before the port magistrate, careful presentation of documentation, proving the silk's legitimate origin, and testimony from Alastair himself regarding the accusation's suspicious timing, coinciding precisely with Nathaniel Cross's recent defeat before the Noble Council. The magistrate, presented with clear evidence of the shipment's legitimacy, alongside compelling suggestion of malicious intent behind the anonymous accusation, ultimately ruled in Alara's favor, releasing both ships and their cargo while formally dismissing the smuggling charges entirely. But the victory, while significant, came with a warning attached. The magistrate, in his final ruling, noted that whoever had orchestrated the false accusation had done so with clear malicious intent, and recommended a formal investigation into the source of the anonymous complaint. Within days, that investigation traced the accusation directly back to correspondence bearing Nathaniel Cross's own seal, a final, damning piece of evidence that would ensure his complete disgrace among noble society. Nathaniel, upon learning that his final desperate scheme had not only failed, but had been definitively traced back to him, disappeared from public life entirely, retreating to a distant property far from the noble circles that had once courted his ambitions. The Cross family's reputation, already damaged by the earlier revelations regarding 2 generations of sabotage against the Rothvane estate, collapsed entirely in the wake of this final, clumsy attempt at revenge. For Alara, the crisis, however frightening in the moment, ultimately strengthened Whitmore Trading's reputation rather than damaging it. Her competitors and colleagues throughout Belhaven watched with genuine admiration, as she navigated the false accusations with clear-eyed determination, emerging not only vindicated, but with her business relationships strengthened by the demonstrated integrity of her operations. Several new trading partners, impressed by her composure under pressure, sought out contracts with Whitmore Trading in the weeks that followed, more than making up for whatever brief disruption the crisis had caused. But perhaps more significant than the business outcome was what the crisis revealed about the relationship slowly rebuilding between Alara and Alastair. He had come to her defense without hesitation, risking his own reputation and resources for a business that carried no benefit to his own interests, motivated purely by genuine care for what she had built and genuine respect for the woman who had built it. It was, Alara realized as the crisis finally settled, precisely the kind of unconditional support she had once believed impossible to find in her marriage. "You did not have to risk so much," she told him one evening, as they sat together in Margaret's modest but comfortable parlor, the immediate crisis finally behind them. "Your own reputation could have suffered significantly had the magistrate ruled differently." "I would have made the same choice regardless of the risk," Alastair said simply. "You are not simply the mother of my daughter, Alara, nor merely a woman I once wronged and now hope to make amends toward. You are someone I have come to genuinely admire, in ways that extend far beyond obligation or guilt. I could not stand by and watch Nathaniel destroy something you built through your own remarkable effort, regardless of what cost that protection might carry for my own standing." Alara studied him carefully, searching his expression for any trace of calculation or self-interest, and finding none. Whatever remained of the cold, dismissive young man who had spoken such careless words on their wedding night had been genuinely, thoroughly replaced by someone who understood, at last, exactly what partnership and respect truly required. "I believe you," she said finally, the words carrying a weight that went beyond simple acknowledgement. "And I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely glad that you were here." It was Beatrice, in her innocent, direct way, who finally articulated what both her parents had been circling around for weeks without quite naming. Playing in Margaret's garden one afternoon while the adults discussed the final resolution of the crisis, she looked up at her parents with the guileless curiosity only a child possesses and asked, "Are you going to stay married now? Properly, I mean, not just because of me." The question hung in the air, and Alara felt her breath catch as she looked toward Alastair, uncertain how he might answer such a direct, unguarded query. He knelt down to Beatrice's level, taking her small hands in his, before answering with a sincerity that carried clearly to Alara as well. "That depends entirely on your mother," he said gently. "I would like nothing more than to stay married properly, not out of duty or obligation, but because I have come to love her, genuinely and completely, in ways I did not understand myself capable of when we first married. But that choice belongs to her, not to me, and I will respect whatever she decides." Beatrice turned her curious gaze toward Alara, waiting with the patient expectation of a child who has just witnessed something significant, even if she does not fully understand its weight. Alara felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes as she looked at her small daughter, then at Alastair, still kneeling beside their child with genuine vulnerability written across his features. "I need time," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she had spent years carefully guarding against. "Not because I doubt your sincerity, Alastair, but because trust rebuilt after such profound hurt cannot be rushed, even by genuine love. Can you accept that?" "I can accept anything," Alastair said, "except giving up on the possibility of a future with you and Beatrice together. Take whatever time you require, Alara. I will be here, proving through consistent action rather than mere words, that I have genuinely become the man you deserve." That evening, after Beatrice had been settled into bed and the household had grown quiet, Alara found herself standing at the window of her small room in Margaret's house, looking out over the harbor lights reflecting against the dark water. She thought of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had once stood in a grand bedchamber, listening to cold, dismissive words that had shattered her expectations of marriage entirely. She thought of the years since, the life she had built through her own determination, the daughter she had raised surrounded by genuine warmth, the business that had proven her capable of far more than anyone had ever expected from a discarded duchess. And she thought of Alistair, kneeling in Margaret's garden, offering his daughter and indirectly herself genuine vulnerability rather than careless dismissal, patience rather than demand, love rather than mere obligation. She did not know, standing at that window with the harbor stretching out before her, exactly what her final decision would be. But for the first time since her wedding night, years earlier, she allowed herself to believe that whatever choice she ultimately made, it would be entirely her own, made not from duty or desperation, but from genuine consideration of what might bring lasting happiness to herself and her daughter both. The path forward remained uncertain, but Alara Whitmore, standing tall and unbroken despite everything she had endured, faced that uncertainty with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every challenge since the moment a careless duke had told her to give him an heir and disappear. 3 months passed before Alara gave Alistair her answer, 3 months during which he proved, through patient and consistent action rather than grand gestures, that his transformation was genuine rather than temporary. He divided his time deliberately between Rothvane Manor and Belhaven, ensuring the estate remained stable while also making himself a steady, reliable presence in Beatrice's daily life, and in the quiet rhythms of Alara's world in the port city she had made her own. He learned the names of her business partners and remembered the details of her ongoing negotiations. He asked genuine questions about Whitmore trading, not as polite formality, but out of real curiosity about the enterprise she had built from nothing. He never once suggested she abandon the life she had created, never once hinted that returning to Rothvane Manor should mean surrendering the independence she had fought so hard to establish. Instead, he began quietly investing in expanding the manor's own trading connections, suggesting partnerships between the estate's agricultural exports and Alara's textile imports, not to claim credit for her success, but simply to find genuine, practical ways their two worlds might complement rather than compete with each other. Margaret watched this careful courtship unfold with the sharp, assessing eye of a woman who had seen many marriages built on far shakier foundations than the one now slowly reforming between her cousin and the Duke. "He has changed," Margaret admitted to Alara one evening as they sat together reviewing the latest shipping manifests. "I did not expect to say that, given how thoroughly he wronged you at the beginning, but I have watched him these past months, and whatever arrogance once defined him seems genuinely, thoroughly gone." "I have noticed the same thing," Alara admitted, "and it frightens me almost as much as it reassures me." "Why frighten you?" "Because if I allow myself to trust this change completely," Alara said slowly, "and I am wrong, the cost of that mistake would not simply be my own heartbreak. It would be Beatrice's as well, and I am not certain I could forgive myself for exposing her to that kind of disappointment twice." Margaret reached across the table and took her cousin's hand, her expression softening with genuine understanding. "No one can promise you certainty, Alara, not in love and not in life generally. But I will say this, the woman who left Rothvane Manor 4 years ago would never have survived what you built since then if she did not possess remarkable courage. Perhaps that same courage is exactly what this decision requires now, not certainty, but simply the willingness to try, with clear eyes open to whatever risk remains." Alara thought of her cousin's words often in the weeks that followed, turning them over alongside the accumulated evidence of Alistair's genuine transformation, weighing everything against the memory of that cold wedding night that had once defined her entire understanding of what marriage to him might mean. The final decision came, fittingly, in the same garden where their fragile understanding had first begun to take root, years earlier. Alistair had traveled to Belhaven for what had become a regular monthly visit, and Alara found him one evening in the small garden behind Margaret's house, where he had taken to helping Beatrice tend a small patch of flowers the girl had claimed as her own personal project. "She insisted on planting lavender," Alistair said, glancing up as Alara approached, a faint, warm smile crossing his features at the sight of her. She said it reminded her of the garden at Rothvane Manor, the one you told her you once rescued from neglect. Alara knelt beside the small flower bed, examining the careful rows of young lavender plants with genuine tenderness. She remembers that story. She has asked me to tell it to her many times, Alastair said. I believe she finds it reassuring, somehow, that her mother is the kind of person who rescues neglected things and helps them flourish again. The words settled over Alara with unexpected weight, and she looked up at Alastair, finding him watching her with an expression of quiet, patient hope that carried none of the arrogant certainty he had once shown on their wedding night, replaced instead by genuine humility and unwavering devotion. I have made my decision, she said softly. Alastair's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had passed between them over the years settling into the quiet evening air. I do not offer this decision out of obligation, or duty, or even simply for Beatrice's sake, though her happiness certainly factors into my thinking, Alara continued. I offer it because I have watched you these past months, Alastair, and I have seen a man genuinely transformed from the one who once dismissed me so carelessly. I have seen patience where there was once arrogance, humility where there was once cold command, and genuine partnership where there was once nothing but obligation. I choose you, not because circumstances have made that choice convenient, but because I genuinely believe we might build something real together, on terms that honor exactly who I have become. I promise you, Alastair said, his voice thick with emotion as he took her hands in his, that I will spend every remaining day of our life together proving myself worthy of that choice. You will never again hear careless words from me, Alara. You will never again feel dismissed or discarded or valued only for your usefulness rather than for exactly who you are. I love you, completely and without condition, and I intend to demonstrate that love through every choice I make from this day forward. They were married again, formally, several months later, in a ceremony that bore no resemblance to the cold, rushed affair that had first bound them together as strangers fulfilling obligation rather than genuine desire. This time, Alara wore a gown of her own choosing, in colors that reflected her own taste rather than tradition alone. Margaret stood beside her as witness, tears of genuine joy in her eyes rather than the polite formality that had marked the first ceremony. Beatrice, now old enough to understand the significance of the day, scattered flower petals down the aisle with delighted enthusiasm, clearly thrilled to witness her parents finally choosing each other freely rather than out of obligation. Alastair, standing at the altar as Alara approached, felt none of the cold detachment that had defined him on their first wedding day. Instead, watching the woman who had built an entire life from the ashes of his cruelty, who had returned not out of weakness but out of strength, who had ultimately chosen him not because she needed him, but because she genuinely wanted him, he felt something he had never fully understood himself capable of feeling: complete, unguarded joy. I love you, he whispered to her as she reached his side, the words carrying none of the careless indifference of years earlier, but instead the full weight of genuine devotion, hard-won through years of patience, growth, and consistent proof of change. I love you too, Alara replied, and for the first time since that cold wedding night so many years earlier, she felt no hesitation, no careful guarding of her heart, only genuine, unshadowed happiness. They built their life together in the years that followed on exactly the foundation Alara had insisted upon from the beginning: genuine partnership rather than obligation, mutual respect rather than mere duty. Whitmore Trading continued to flourish under Alara's careful management, its operations eventually expanding to include partnerships with the agricultural exports from Rothvane Manor's own lands, creating a combined enterprise that benefited from both her sharp business acumen and Alastair's careful stewardship of the estate. She divided her time between Belhaven and Rothvane Manor, never once asked to sacrifice the independence she had built, always treated as an equal partner in every decision that affected their shared life. Beatrice grew into a bright, confident young woman, raised with the unwavering knowledge that both her parents genuinely loved and valued her, that her mother's strength and her father's eventual growth had together created a home built on authentic affection rather than careful arrangement. She would, in later years, often tell the story of her parents' unlikely reconciliation to her own children, emphasizing always the lesson her mother had taught her through her own example. That dignity, once claimed, could never truly be taken away, regardless of how carelessly others might try to diminish it. Nathaniel Cross lived out the remainder of his years in quiet disgrace, his family's reputation permanently damaged by the exposed history of sabotage and deceit spanning 2 generations. He never again attempted to challenge the Rothwein succession, and his name became, within noble circles, a quiet cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition unchecked by genuine merit or integrity. As for Alastair, he never forgot the lesson his own cruelty had once taught him, nor the extraordinary strength Alara had shown in transforming that cruelty into the foundation for her own remarkable independence. He spoke of it often in later years to anyone who would listen, how a single careless sentence, spoken in arrogance and grief on his wedding night, had nearly cost him everything that ultimately mattered most, and how only through genuine, sustained transformation had he managed to earn back what his own thoughtlessness had once so carelessly discarded. Alara Whitmore Rothwein, Duchess by title but merchant and mother by chosen identity, remained throughout the rest of her life exactly what she had become in the years following that cold wedding night, a woman who understood precisely her own worth, who had built success through her own determined effort, and who had ultimately chosen love not out of necessity, but out of genuine, hard-won belief that some people, given enough time and enough proof of change, truly could become worthy of a second chance. And every spring in the garden at Rothwein Manor, the lavender bloomed in full, vibrant color, a quiet testament to everything that had once been neglected and had, through patience and genuine care, been given the chance to flourish again.